They did not come to eat, they came to be observed. At the royal table, every gesture was a confession, every silence a strategy, every mistake a silent condemnation. A poorly held knife, a gaze too intense, a bite taken too early could be enough to ruin a career, to seal a destiny. Here, the meal was not a pleasure, but a trial, a theatre where power was measured not by force, but by absolute control of the body, time, and silence. For at this table, men were not nourished, they were judged. At the royal table, the meal began long before the dishes arrived. It began in anxiety. At Versailles, under Louis XIV, being invited to dine was not a trivial honor, it was a public exposure. The Sun King used the table as a political instrument. Every guest knew that their position in the room, the distance from the sovereign, the order of service, and even the height of their chair reflected their real importance in the hierarchy of the kingdom. Being seated too far meant silent disgrace. Being close to the king could provoke jealousy, hatred, and plots. The Duke of St. Simon reports that some nobles sometimes prefer to decline an invitation rather than risk a public humiliation that the entire court would remember. Silence was golden, but misplaced silence became suspicious. Speaking too little could be interpreted as arrogance or disdain. Speaking too much could betray excessive ambition. One was watched on how to chew, to drink, to place their hands. Elbows on the table were strictly forbidden because they symbolized loss of control of the body, whereas at court, the body had to be entirely submissive to the discipline of power. Bread, a seemingly trivial food, became a test. It was never cut with a knife, a gesture considered brutal and rustic, but broken delicately by hand, a sign of mastery and civility. Cutting directly on the plate was a serious fault, not only because porcelain, faience, or silver plates were expensive, but because it revealed a lack of refinement incompatible with nobility. In some courts, especially Vienna and Madrid, acidic foods like lemon or vinegar were never to be touched by silver knives, because oxidation caused a metallic taste, considered a profanation of the royal service. This detail, apparently technical, actually served to distinguish the initiated from the ignorant. Anyone committing the error revealed instantly their social origin or lack of education. The fear of poisoning haunted every meal. Official tasters existed, sometimes themselves prisoners of the system, forced to risk their lives daily. Under the Tudors in England, several testimonies mention tasters falling ill after banquets, without it ever being known whether it was an accident or a suppressed plot. Some dishes were avoided for purely political reasons. A dish associated with a rebellious region could be interpreted as a provocation. Refusing a dish was even more dangerous. It symbolically refused the king's hand. At the court of Louis XV, it is said that a courtier who declined a dish out of simple disgust was excluded from meals for months, which equated to social death. Napkins also obeyed a precise code. Never tied around the neck, never shaken, never used to wipe the face. One simply dabbed the lips discreetly. Any excess of cleanliness was suspicious. As if trying to erase a compromising trace, perfumes were monitored. Too strong suggested an attempt to mask a shameful body odor. Too weak could be interpreted as lack of sophistication. Even jewelry was regulated. A jewel that jingled betrayed nervousness or a desire to attract attention. At the British court, especially under Elizabeth I, the table was also a tool of psychological domination. The Queen could stare at a guest for long minutes without speaking, forcing them to eat under the weight of this gaze. Several foreign ambassadors described this experience as deeply unsettling. Leaving the table before the sovereign was strictly forbidden. Even in case of illness, accounts mention nobles fainting in their chairs, discreetly supported by servants, but never allowed to leave. Noble children, present from a very young age, were observed as adults. A clumsy child could compromise the political future of their entire family. In Rome, in some papal courts, food itself became a symbol of purity. Water was sometimes judged impure. Only wine was allowed, even for the youngest. Scraping the plate, blowing on a hot dish, biting directly into a piece of meat, smelling the wine ostentatiously, or expressing the slightest disgust were all faults that could ruin a reputation. Sugar, a rare and precious commodity, had to be handled with almost religious respect. Wasting it was seen as an insult to the kingdom's wealth. Gradually, the meal revealed its true nature, a ritual of obedience. It was not about nourishment, but proving one deserved to exist within the orbit of power. The royal table was a silent tribunal. No verdict was pronounced, but everyone knew, when finally rising as the sovereigns set down their cutlery, whether they had gained favor or lost their place. In France, England, and Spain, the royal table obeyed common superficial rules, but each monarchy used it as a different weapon. At Versailles, the table was a permanent theatre. In England, a psychological trap. In Spain, an instrument of silent terror. The same gesture could signify favor in one kingdom and disgrace in another. France, Versailles, the table as a machine to crush ambitions. At the court of Louis XIV and then Louis XV, the meal was public. Hundreds of eyes observed every movement. The king sometimes ate before the entire court, turning the most intimate act into a demonstration of absolute power. Under Louis XV, some were invited to supper late, served with unusual, almost excessive attention. The next day, they disappeared. These meals were interpreted by contemporaries as disguised farewells. In England, a noble could be invited to dine, then interrogated immediately afterwards, still wearing court attire, without time to prepare. In Spain, some did not even leave the palace, moving from dining hall to secret cells. Throughout Europe, the royal table revealed a brutal truth. Power did not always speak by decree or judgment, but by placement, silence, and food. Eating became a political act, swallowing a dish, accepting a gaze, remaining seated when the body wanted to flee, proved submission. Those who failed did not always fall immediately, but their downfall always began there, between two bites, under gilded chandeliers, in a silence too perfect to be innocent. If the royal table was an instrument of power, it was also a place of permanent fear, for eating meant exposure. For centuries, poison was the most discreet, feared and used weapon against the powerful. Slow, invisible, undetectable at the time, it turned every meal into a potential threat. This fear was not imaginary, it was based on real deaths. In France, from the Middle Ages, fear of poisoning structured the organization of royal meals. Under the Valois and the Bourbons, each dish passed through multiple controlled hands. Foods were prepared in separate, sealed kitchens, monitored by sworn officers. The royal taster was not an honorary role, but a dangerous job. They had to eat each dish before the king, sometimes waiting several minutes, sometimes an hour, to check for visible effects. Several tasters died in the line of duty, but these deaths were rarely made public. Dying in place of the king was part of the tacit contract. Today, these rules seem distant, almost absurd, yet their logic remains. Power has never ceased to observe, test, classify. It has simply changed scenery. Where once a wrong move at table condemned a courtier, today a word too many, a poorly controlled image or a public gesture can ruin a reputation. The royal table has disappeared, but the ritual persists. Power is still recognized by its ability to impose rules without ever explaining them. And as before, those who ignore them often realize their existence only when it is already too late.